Chapter 46, Nature's Wrath. Nature's Wrath. Their search of the room revealed nothing though, bar the chest of cured meat that Itafir had been so glad to present them with, and Fritha soon gave up, taking a joint of it with her as she, Anomen and Herdalis rejoined the others. Back in the main room, the bodies of two more Rakshasa lay dead on the floor, dressed as woodsmen, their tawny fur matted here and there with blood. The air was hazy with disturbed dust. Nalya, Minsk, and Cern still searching through the room's chaos of cupboards and chests, though the three glanced up as they entered, Nalya immediately at her side.
"You are unhurt, dearest." "Yes, but my sword isn't, it broke on the first swing,"
Fritha admitted with a snort of laughter. She was still feeling a touch shaken by the whole thing, truth be told, but there seemed little point in dwelling on it. Nalya looked alarmed though, running her hands nervously over her arms and shoulders as though to assure herself she was still whole, while Minsk crossed the room to them as well, taking the two pieces of broken sword from her with a downcast expression.
"Oh, a sad thing it is, to lose one's weapon." "Well, rather it than me. Honestly dearest, I'm fine."
Fritha smiled, gently batting Nalya away and turning to Jahara as the druid appeared on the stairs with Ari.
"Find anything?"
Jahara nodded grimly.
"Yes, a couple of chests filled with weapons and armor, all whole and showing no signs of any recent fight. You know of the appetites of these creatures? Rakshasa live on human flesh. I suspect the arms belonged to the unfortunate souls who came calling on this house, though whether they were druids or merely travelers I could not say. There are no remains, though the swamp would make them easy to dispose of."
Fritha glanced down to the shank of cured meat she was holding, her stomach sinking unpleasantly.
"Oh, tell me this isn't what I think it is." "Do not worry, child,"
assured Cern, moving to take it from her and examine it more closely.
"It is not human. Wild pig, I think, by the look of it."
He held it out to Jahara, who descended to look it over as well and nod her agreement, the woman tearing a strip from it and touching it to her tongue only to remove it instantly and spit at their feet.
"As I thought, poisoned. I imagine it would have been undetectable once cooked though."
Fritha sighed, relieved by their findings even if it did mean they were rationless once more.
"That must be how they were catching most of their prey,"
reasoned Ari.
"They could offer the meat to travelers and then collect the bodies later. The poison probably doesn't harm Rakshasa." "A meal for a meal, you could almost see it as a fair trade,"
Herdalis offered with a grin, Anomen and Ari sending him the most appalled looks while Fritha tried not to laugh.
"Well, we should start to bed down for the night,"
interrupted Jahara with a frown.
"While you were inside, Minsk spotted a barn on an area of more solid ground just south of here. There are some steps down to it, so it was likely built at a similar time to this place. We can make camp in there." "What?"
exclaimed Nalya suddenly.
"Why are we staying in a barn when we've a perfectly good house here?"
Jahara sighed heavily.
"We cannot stay here, Nalya. Walls may provide shelter but they also blind us. There are still druids abroad and it would be all too easy for them to sneak up and trap us within here should we stay. But the Rakshasa lived here as humans for over a 10 day without any trouble." "We do not know that for sure, my lady,"
said Anomen, his manner a lot gentler than it was usually, though its effect was rather wasted then, Nalya looking all set to argue the point and Fritha reluctantly stepped in.
"Nalya, dearest, we really can't stay here. I'm sure this barn will be fine once we've a fire lit."
Nalya stared at her a moment but made no reply, the girl just shaking her head as she turned away, leaving Fritha with a pained look.
"Good. Well,"
continued Jahara stalwartly,
someone should gather up that firewood, we may as well put it to some use. Minsk, could you take something from these Rakshasa as proof of death? We will need a Tafir's head, but a paw will suffice from the other two, perhaps we can collect some sort of bounty on them.
The man nodded, turning to take up the axe from the nearby woodpile, and Jahara glanced back to the girl next to her who was still wearing a hollow look.
I am going to make a check of the surrounding area. Perhaps you can join me, Fritha, it never hurts to practice your scouting.
The girl sent her a dull nod, not fooled for a moment, it seemed.
Yes, fine, I'm coming.
And together they left the house in a silence that lasted well into their walk, the women scouting down the rough steps to the edge of river, before circling around and moving back up onto the bridge to skirt through the woods at the back of the house. Jahara halted in the dense undergrowth, knowing what she had to do and steeling herself for the task.
Fritha.
The girl stopped as well, glancing back to her questioningly, clearly under the impression she had seen something. Jahara drew a breath.
Fritha, I know you do not want to hear this. Then don't say it,
Fritha cut in evenly, turning to resume her path, and Jahara sighed tersely, her reaction no easier to bear for all its predictability.
This life is not for her, Fritha. She's just still getting used to it is all. She was living in a castle only 2 months ago. Fritha,
Jahara snapped, grabbing her arm to halt her,
this is not just going to go away, you know, however much you ignore it. You must talk to Nalya.
Fritha shook her off, plainly frustrated.
I have, and she says she is fine. Look.
The girl reasoned, almost pleading,
who isn't sick of camping in weather like this? You're making too much of it.
Jahara sighed, but pressed the point no further, following the girl as she set a swift pace back to the barn. It was a squat circular building of the same sandstone and red tile as the house. Its doors were gone, probably taken long ago for firewood or some other purpose, leaving the wide arched doorway open, and Jahara could see the others inside, sat in amongst the bushels of dried reeds that the place had once been used to store. Fritha had been right. The building was almost hospitable in the blaze of the newly lit fire. The group gathered about it on the reed-strewn floor, while Herr Dallas entertained them with what appeared to be an impression of Fritha breaking her sword, the tiefling swinging out only to do an amusing double take and begin flailing wildly, though it was not something everyone was finding humorous.
Will you stop that?
Snapped a Nomen, to a background of laughter, Fritha giggling more than anyone as she walked into the barn.
Oh, give over, a Nomen. No harm done, and I imagine it must have looked pretty funny.
He stared up at her, his face a mask in the flickering light of the fire.
No,
he answered finally, his voice cold,
it did not.
Fritha opened her mouth again, and from the look of her, she was more than willing to continue their previous quarrel, in front of everyone or not. Jahara quickly stepped in.
Well, your brush with death, however amusing, cannot be to everyone's tastes, Fritha. Now someone will have to go and collect more wood, there's not enough for the night there. And we'll need water as well. The nearby river looked stagnant, but I noticed an old pump at the far side of the house.
Around her the group broke up, everyone moving off to their chosen tasks, leaving her and the girl alone once more.
Fritha,
Jahara began, wondering if she dared to return to their previous conversation, though Fritha clearly predicted this.
Oral's breath, it's cold out there,
she sighed blithely, moving towards the fire and holding her hands as close to it as she could stand. Jahara frowned but took the hint.
Fritha, move back from there. You'll give yourself chilblains.
The girl sent her a sullen look, shifting back slightly, though Jahara had the distinct impression it was only until her attention was diverted by Cernde, the druid's arms full of what looked to be misshapen cork discs that she recognized as a type of tree fungus.
"Here,"
Cernde announced as he approached them, the man mildly pleased with himself from his tone.
"Dried saddle. It is quite nutritious. We can use them up to supplement our rations."
Jahara watched as he placed his bag upon one of the bushels and set the mushrooms gently on top.
"Yes, and you've quite a haul, though I imagine it is much easier to find such when you already have an idea of where to look. Why did you not mention you are already known here?"
Cernde straightened slowly as he answered, and Jahara had the impression he was delaying the moment when he would have to face her.
"Yes, perhaps I could have said something earlier, but did not seem important. After all, you do not need to see the seed to know the plant. This grove was where I first learned the ways of the druid under Gragas. He was a kind and patient mentor, and I was very happy here for a time." "And yet you left?"
The man shrugged mildly.
"I wished to see more of the land, all the wondrous diversity of nature, and when a chance to serve the Grand Druid in the north arose, I volunteered immediately. But what of you?"
He smiled, genially changing the subject, and Jahara let him.
"This seems to be an interesting group you have found yourself traveling with. How did you meet them?" "The girl, Fritha, was the ward of an old friend. I took over her guardianship after he passed on when the Iron Crisis was a plague across these lands. As for the others, they are just people we met along the way who shared goals or ideals. We look now to raise monies to ensure the release of another of our company who has fallen foul of Athkatla's stringent magic laws."
Cernde nodded slowly, grey eyes watching her carefully.
"A strange course for one who has chosen the path that you have. I would have thought the care of nature as a whole would have taken priority over the service of merely one of her children."
Jahara gave a gesture somewhere between a nod and a shrug and turned away, his observance a little too incisive for her liking.
"We must all serve the balance as we see fit, Fritha. But I'm cold."
But Jahara was unmoved by her complaints, knowing the girl would feel a whole lot worse if her hands were covered in painful itchy lumps, and she distracted her with the task of preparing the evening meal. Once a Nomen returned with the water, the girl astounding everyone by heating it with just a look. Even with the mushrooms Cernde had found, though, their rations were looking rather grim, and it seemed as though the majority of their meal would consist of stale whey bread and a vegetable broth that would be mostly water. That was until Minsk returned to the barn, a bloody linen bag in his hand, which he opened to reveal the limp, glistening bodies of a good dozen frogs for their evening meal, which everyone hailed a brilliant idea once over their initial repulsion. Well, nearly everyone.
"We're going to eat frogs?"
cried Ari, pausing in her peeling and looking no less than nauseated as she eyed the sodden bag.
"Do not fret, Ari, they taste just as poultry,"
assured Jahara, passing the bag to the girl next to her.
"It's funny how people say that, isn't it?"
continued Fritha cheerfully as she settled down next to the woman with her knife and began to clean the creatures, passing them to Jahara to skewer and balance over the fire.
"I mean, if they are to taste of anything, it should surely be of frogs."
Herr Dallas glanced up from the two pieces of her sword that he had been examining to nod.
"Indeed, my raven, perhaps it is the other way round. Frogs do not taste of poultry, perhaps poultry tastes of frogs."
Ari looked horrified by the mere thought.
"Look at it this way,"
reasoned Nalia to the elf, as she began slicing a battered old onion into the now boiling water.
"This would be considered a delicacy in Sembia."
Ari said nothing, just continued peeling her rather soft potato, but by the expression on her face, she wouldn't be visiting there anytime soon. Across the fire, Herr Dallas sighed, holding the broken sword up to the firelight with a frown.
"Well, I could try a charm to mend it, my raven, but I would not trust it in battle afterwards. Still, if you wished to have it whole for some sentimental value.
Frithia smiled but shook her head.
Thank you, but you're all right. It's only a sword after all, and I never could understand those people who got all attached to their weapons.
She shook her head with a frown, seemed a bit unhealthy.
No, I'll just have to buy another one once we get back to trade meet. And what do you plan to use in the meantime?
Questioned Jahara, and the girl sent her a cheeky smile.
Well, I've been working on my withering glare,
she offered, continuing with a sigh when it became clear Jahara was not amused.
Minsk.
Here she nodded respectfully to the man in question.
Brought me a couple of swords from amongst the things the Rakshasa had taken. A bit unwieldy by the look of them, but I'm sure one will do for the moment, unless you want to lend me one of yours, Sparrow.
All eyes turned to the tiefling, but he shook his head, regretful but quite unashamed of his refusal.
Alas, my raven, I would rather not. They serve me best as a pair, for entropy and chaos should go hand in hand. Entropy and chaos,
Frithia repeated, her voice shrill with incredulous amusement.
You named your swords Entropy and Chaos. Oh, stop laughing, just because you are not insightful enough to appreciate it,
snapped Ari in sharp response to the bard's deeply affronted look.
Save your breath to cool your porridge, Ari,
retorted Nalya, the girl quick to her defense, and Frithia felt a pleasant jolt in her stomach. She sent the bard an apologetic grin.
Oh, no, you misunderstand me, I'm quite taken with the idea. I could name all my things too.
And with a flurry of nimble fingers she spun the knife she held with a flourish.
Oh, vegetables, quail, and pray mercy at its name, rind vein.
Nalya laughed for the first time all evening, and Frithia beamed, the mood of the group somewhat lifted as they ate their strange hodgepodge of a meal together, the dusk bringing with it a warmer, albeit damp, weight to the breeze, the air thrumming with the chirp of crickets, the sound mixing almost melodically with the distant croaking of frogs at the riverside. Ari drew in a long breath. She was supposed to be practicing her embroidery, thought she was currently distracted watching the moths play above the fire, the air around her infused with the scent of the rich damp earth. The fens were quite a pleasant place when you didn't have to hike through them. Ari glanced to the camp about her. Most of the others just sat quietly enjoying the peace of the place, Frithia having another lesson on Rashmi from Minsk, while Nalya had made a start on one of the books they had bought. Ari smiled, laying down her embroidery to catch the girl's eye.
How is the story?
Nalya smiled.
Quite good, but the plot is a little cliched. The heroine has just fallen from her horse and twisted her ankle in the very same forest where the hero happens to live. I'm expecting him to make a convenient appearance any page now. It's always something like that, isn't it?
Frithia began thoughtfully to no one in particular, gesturing to them causally with her stylus.
An ankle, or wrist, or knee, something immobilizing, but not physically marring. I mean, the heroine never trips over and breaks her nose, or falls from her horse only to get her foot caught in the stirrup and be dragged through 2 thickets and a shallow puddle before her timely rescue.
A noman snorted noisily, trying to hide it in a cough, and Ari suspected she was grinning at the exact same thing. An image of Frithia coming unbidden to her mind, stood bruised and mudded, her already wild hair filled with leaves.
Well, do not get any ideas for tomorrow. I doubt there are any gallant heroes around here to step in and rescue you,
commented Jahara dryly, ignoring Herr Dallas and Anoman's affronted looks to rise and add more wood to the fire, and Frithia sprang to her feet to stand next to her, the girl's voice coming high and breathy, one hand held against her forehead as though she was constantly on the brink of a swoon.
Oh, thank the gods you found me. I was just riding through this forest on my way to the nearest Ilmataran shrine to read stories to the orphans, when I was thrown from my horse. A fall that has left my hair and face thankfully untouched, though has inconveniently sprained my ankle. I fear you shall have to carry me,"
she cried, throwing herself into the druid's arms.
"I fear not,"
the woman snorted over their laughter, dumping her charge unceremoniously onto the reeds.
"You wound me, druid,"
Fritha sighed, gasping slightly as she shifted and began rubbing her lower back vigorously.
"Oh, you have as well. Our flirtations left more than just my heart bruised." "Fritha!"
Jahara laughed, aiming a kick at her before crouching down to inspect the damage.
"Ah, you landed on a stone,"
she confirmed, lifting the girl's tunic and shirt to examine the red mark that was blossoming on the small of her back.
"Landed? Yes, with a little help,"
Fritha mumbled, hissing as the druid laid a hand over it.
"It is just bruised, stop making a fuss,"
dismissed Jahara, though Ari thought she looked a touch guilty. Fritha was muttering darkly under her breath as she shifted back to her books, Hairdalis moving to join her, and soon it was all forgot as the two sank deep in talk. Fritha was showing the tiefling one of the odes she had transcribed verbatim from Minsk earlier, the girl halfway through an attempt to translate it, though Hairdalis had succeeded in distracting her with discussion of the actual prose.
"Well, it seems quite complicated,"
the girl explained with a grave frown. "The poems use the tonal qualities of the language and run like songs. Therefore, not only must you think of a line's rhythm, but also its tone and inflection."
"Fascinating,"
said Hairdalis. "Dull," thought Ari, and bit back a sigh, instantly cross at herself. The more time that passed, the more it became clear that her little white lie about being a devotee of such things was one that she would reap tenfold. She did like the theatre, that itself was no lie. The thrill of being sat in some darkened playhouse, watching as a story played out before your eyes, the music and the costumes and the sheer energy of it all. But it was becoming increasingly apparent that acting itself just really wasn't for her. She felt too self-conscious, stood pretending to be something she was not, and though she rather enjoyed reading through the occasional scene with the bard when they were alone together, she had no desire to do the same before an entire theatre. She knew what Hairdalis thought. It was obvious from the roles he chose for her, that some grand actress hid inside this timid shell and had to be brought to blossom. But the truth was, meek though she still may have seemed when compared to him, Ari did not feel even half as timorous as she had in the circus, even with all the danger that constantly seemed to surround them, and this grand actress was refusing to be coaxed out simply because she was not there. She sighed slightly and opened the bag at her side, staring down at the corner of the green volume she could see nestled in amongst her books and clothes. The Plays of Erudice. Something Hairdalis had gone to a lot of trouble to find for her, and she knew she should just like it for that alone. But the fact remained, she would have much preferred some jewelry or perfume or something slightly more personal from the one she called love, and ironic though it had been, she had had to do quite a bit of acting when he had presented it to her, as she had nodded and smiled and pretended to be as pleased as he was. She glanced to the man again, still sat with Fritha, both laughing as they pored over the parchment she held. Ari smiled faintly, considering how handsome he looked in the firelight. Aficionado of the theatre or not, her affection for him was certainly no act. Ari shook her head, resolved to finally get on with some embroidery, when next to her Cern shifted where he sat, the terse sigh that accompanied the movement seemingly unnoticed by all but she.
Are you still in pain?"
she asked quietly.
"Lord Coprath said you were set about quite badly by the townsfolk."
But he merely shook his head, easing himself into a more comfortable position.
No, child, it is nothing."
Ari frowned.
"Well, I am glad for that, though do wish you would stop referring to me as child. Why, I'm probably 4 times your age."
Cern stared at her a moment, seemingly taken aback, before a smile was pulling at his mouth and he was chuckling quietly, hissing slightly as his ribs shook, and she could not help but join him, as amused as she was embarrassed by her outburst.
Forgive me, Ari, I meant it as no reflection on your maturity. You are a child of nature, as are we all, though I note a special affinity within you.
Ari smiled, quite flattered he had given the matter any consideration at all. She shrugged mildly, letting her eyes linger on the doorway to the gloaming marsh beyond.
There is a wild order to nature, an ever-changing beauty that I cannot help but find peace in. Even here, though I will admit I must look harder than usual.
Cern smiled slightly, sending her a measured look.
Yes, nature's beauty is not always apparent, though in some of her aspects it is all too easy to see.
Ari flushed, unsure as to why she felt so suddenly awkward.
Yes, well, And what is this?
Interrupted a smooth voice above them, and she started, glancing up to find Herr Dallas stood at her side, the man sinking to sit next to her with a smile.
My dove, you're as pink as a camilla. I know there is a chill to the air, but you should not sit so close to the fire.
He scolded gently, putting an arm about her, and she felt her stomach stir at the dark look he sent the druid, shamefully pleased by his jealousy. Though not the way she would like it to be expressed, it was nice to know he cared. It was early, a gnomon guessing the time at about an hour before the dawn by the grey milky look to the clear arc of sky he could see beyond the barn. He had been awake for the last hour or so, sat at the doorway and huddled under his blankets and cloak as he took the last watch. But early as it was, he was not the only one awake from the sighs and stirring of those about him, and, by the steady snoring from the huge pile of blankets in the far corner, he guessed Minsk was the only one of them who had managed to remain asleep. The fire had already gone out by the time Cern had awoken a gnomon for his watch, their meager supply of wood gathered from the marsh quickly running out, though it had still been too dark to gather any more, and a gnomon knew from experience that attempting to burn the dried reeds would produce smoke enough to suffocate them. It had been very fortunate they had found that barn to shelter in, the thick walls holding in most of the heat from their small fire, though even then, the night had been a difficult one. He glanced to the cold ashes before him. It was just light enough now to venture out to try and find some more wood, and he was just mustering the will to leave his post when Fritha stirred, the girl sitting up still wrapped in her blankets, her hair tousled, though for all that, she looked wide awake.
Oh, I give up. I've just been lying there for the last hour waiting for the morning. So have I,
sighed Ari, sitting as well while the bard stirred at her side, and a gnomon watched as the others began to rouse themselves too, Minsk rolling onto his back to yawn widely.
By Berver, it's so cold.
Cern nodded, stretching out his shoulders.
Yes, nature can be harsh as well as nurturing, though such extremes are a part of her wonder.
Herr Dallas sent a gnomon an exasperated look and rolled his eyes, and the squire had to do his best not to laugh.
I can't feel my hands,
murmured Nalia absently, the girl flexing her long white fingers with a sort of distracted hopelessness.
Gods!
Fritha cried, pulling her foot closer with wide eyes.
I think I've got frostbite. Oh no, wait, it's just dirt.
The girl laughed, some of the others managing a smile, though Nalia sent her a blank look.
Oh, come on, that was pretty funny.
Fritha cajoled brightly, taking up Nalia's hands and placing them somewhere within the depths of her blankets, a shiver traveling her narrow frame.
Goodness, dearest, you are cold.
Nalia said nothing, just shifted closer to the girl, laying her forehead upon her shoulder as though she would return to sleep where she sat.
Someone needs to go and collect more wood,
muttered Jahara, finally sitting as well and rubbing her bleary face briskly. Anoman shifted again, preparing to haul himself up.
I shall go, I was planning to anyway. Don't bother,
yawned Fritha.
You won't find any dry wood this early and it'll be an hour before the fire's properly hot anyway. Sorry,
cried Nalya, snatching her hands back to straighten abruptly. Fritha avoided her eye.
If we break camp now, we can warm up as we walk. She is right,
admitted Jahara reluctantly. But Ari looked about as enthused by this plan as Nalya did.
But what about breakfast?
Fritha shrugged.
You wouldn't usually eat this early anyway, would you? We can stop for breakfast once the sun's up.
Yes, agreed Minsk with his usual amiability. The man sat in his bedding and looking quite well rested.
Boo says this is sensible, we would do the same in Rashomon.
Fritha nodded once, making to rise.
Exactly. Well, come on then,
she urged when no one else moved, and it was to a background of sullen muttering that the group rose and quickly broke camp. They were walking now, the marsh eerily quiet about them, a light mist still hanging wraith-like in the trees. The two druids were leading with the ranger, Nalya, and Ari a short way behind them with the bard, the girls huddled together and looking mutinous, while Fritha brought up the back of the group with him, the girl seemingly resolved in her decision, however unpopular it had made her, and still pointedly ignoring him. Anoman shifted under his heavy pack and nearly slipped, the ground all the wetter for the morning's mists. Fritha glanced to him, wordlessly turning back once she was assured he was fine, and he felt his stomach tighten, the man steeling himself to finally break the silence between them.
Are you cold, my lady? A bit,
she conceded, though the weather had nothing on her tone. Anoman swallowed dryly, turning back to the path ahead as he felt his face burn.
I must apologize for my behavior yesterday, I should not have spoken to you like that.
Next to him, he heard the girl sigh.
No, you shouldn't, but I was angry about something else as well, and you got more than your fair share of my temper. Forget about it.
He smiled ruefully at her words, though he was glad they were back on good terms. He did not like it when they argued.
I would that I could forget, my lady. I have been dwelling upon what Sir Ryan said of my test, of how it will be soon. It creeps ever closer and I feel no more ready than when was first squired. My temper is just as wretched, I am just as full of this anger as I ever was, perhaps more so since Moira was taken.
Fritha went to speak, but he cut her off with a shake of his head.
But, such is no excuse and I will not hear otherwise. I was taking my frustrations out on you and only when you told me what I have known all along. You are right, I should have spoken to Sir Ryan about this long ago, I just could not bring myself to admit it to him. It was by his kindness I was allowed to enter the order as a squire in the first instance. I could not bear to tell him of this failing and have him know I am unworthy of the honor he bestowed upon me.
He glanced down to find Fritha sending him a measured look.
Well, Sir Ryan could possibly think you are unworthy, but he could not know you're unworthy unless you are. How we view ourselves can be as, if not more important as how others perceive us, Anoman.
Anoman turned away, feeling uncomfortable and casting about for a change of subject.
So you said you were cold, my lady?
The girl sighed again, though she smiled as well.
It's Fritha, and I'm freezing. But since this madness was my idea, it is only right I suffer along with the rest of you. I believe it was the most sensible suggestion, given the circumstances. It is warmer when you are moving.
She snorted, her breath misting in the bitter air.
Maybe for you, but I'm cold to my bones. Poor bones. Yours are all right, they've got all that muscle keeping them warm. All mine have our skin and about 4 layers. No substitute.
ARandomAudiobookAppeared took a moment to reply to this. He was rather surprised she had noticed.
Yes, but I suppose such hardships are to be expected in this path we have chosen to walk.
Frithla laughed, gesturing about them.
Oh yes, and I suppose this is what you imagined when you daydreamed about your life as a knight when a boy in the seminary, is it?
ARandomAudiobookAppeared smiled, dipping his head in acquiescence.
I conceded that perhaps I did not imagine it quite like this. And what of you, my lady? What idle reverie would take you from your errands in the library? Are you sure you want to know? It had nothing to do with halting the tides of chaos.
He smiled dryly, remembering the gloom of a sewer tunnel and their argument so long ago.
I will take that risk.
Frithla laughed lightly.
I just wanted to travel really, see the world, although my ideas and the reality deviated slightly. I had a very pleasant fantasy that I would sleep every night in a bed with fine linen sheets and all my traveling would be done in sunshine.
ARandomAudiobookAppeared glanced to her.
But you are happy in what you do now?
She shrugged vaguely.
Well, I suppose. But it would be nice to travel on my own terms. Choose where I wanted to go and not have to fight something when I get there. Or get up really early in the mornings and have to walk all day when I'd just much rather stay in bed. Can we stop yet?
Ari called back to them hopefully, a hand pointing eastwards.
The sky over there is pink.
Frithla sighed crossly.
Can you see the sun?
Ari turned back to their path with a disgruntled look and Frithla shook her head, tiredly amused.
Gods, I'd hate to travel with me. When we find Imoen, will she travel with you?
Frithla glanced to him, looking mildly surprised he had asked.
You know what? I don't know. Imoen and I didn't really have a choice of things to begin with. She may want to return to Kendall Keep or join one of the mage schools, I'm not sure. And you, my lady? More traveling, I suppose, but somewhere warmer.
She bit back a sigh as her foot disappeared into a deceptively solid-looking patch of bog with an unpleasant squelch.
And dry. Definitely dry.
ARandomAudiobookAppeared smiled faintly, about to reply when another voice cut him off.
Halt, stand where you're at, outsiders.
The flurry of movement around him as weapons were drawn, Frithla heaving out her own clumsy blade, while ARandomAudiobookAppeared drew his mace, all watching as 5 men stepped from the mists to surround them, each accompanied by some cat or wolf and one even followed by the shaggy lumbering form of a bear.
Oh, hells!
Breathed Frithla, one of the men stepping forward from the others, black-haired and slow-eyed, his blade glinting wetly as the air condensed upon it.
You are trespassing on sacred ground and your careless meandering will go unheeded no longer.
Cern stepped forward as well, eyes blazing behind his composed countenance.
We trespass nowhere, Lind. This land is free for all who wish to travel it and travel it we will, we have business with Baldur. Cerned!
Cried one of the druids, some instantly looking wary, while others seemed almost hopeful. Lind, however, looked furious.
I care not one whit for your business, dog, this grove is under our protection. And a sterling job you're doing as well,
snorted Frithla with disdain.
3 Rakshasa living here right under your nose.
Lind adjusted his grip on his blade as those behind him began to mutter amongst themselves, his eyes gaining a hungry look as though he would have liked nothing better than to kill her where she stood.
She speaks truly, continued Sund. Faldern presses her fight to the town while her own grove suffers, and I would speak with her about it. And what good will it do? You know she had bonded with the grove, Sund,
called one of the younger men, and Lind shot him a quelling glare.
Watch your tongue, Rias, you will pay a high price for any disloyalty. Enough!
Barked Sund suddenly, almost trembling in his anger.
I have been patient, but I have asked you take us to Faldern twice now, and I will not ask again.
Everyone looked wary now, even Lind. One of the men swallowed nervously, cautiously approaching their leader.
Come on, Lind, where is the harm? He represents the Grand Druid, Faldern may wish to meet with him.
Lind just stared at Sund, his loathing evident before he nodded stiffly and turned on his heel.
Fine, we go.
And the group set off once more, though much increased in number, the druids walking in amongst them now, their creatures prowling about the edge of the party, ever watchful. Sund swallowed, his blood still roaring in his ears as his mind alternately cursed and calmed him. He knew he should not have lost control like that, and he felt almost sick as he considered what could have happened, what he had been moments away from. Lind stirred at his side, the only one of them with his blade still drawn, though Sund knew the druid would make no move against him now. Faldern would have that pleasure. They were at the head of the group, and behind him could sense the others following them, all nervous and chary, Ares' voice quiet but audible.
I knew we should have had breakfast when we had the chance. Oh, stop whining,
he heard Fritha sigh.
It's not as though we had anything nice to eat anyway.
A pause, the sound of her rummaging in her bag before,
here.
Next to him, Lind smiled broadly.
Oh, you've allied yourself with a proper sort, haven't you, Sund? I can see why you would fit in with these freaks though.
Sund felt his jaw clench, refusing to be baited.
Save your bile, Lind, your words are nothing to me.
A contemptuous snort.
Ah yes, the same superior Sund, you always were one of Gragas's favored. But don't forget that he has gone, and we know what you are, what you're capable of.
Sund swallowed, his eyes fixed unseeing on the path ahead of them as they walked, though he said nothing in his defense. How could he, when part of him knew Lind was right? End of chapter.